Had you anticipated this kind of decisive move by Azerbaijan?
Unless Armenia is willing to make serious concessions, Azerbaijan eventually wins on the ground. The Karabakh conflict was only part of a much larger issue of the sorting out of peoples and territories in the South Caucasus.
Land swap element is no longer tenable.
The question is, what's next in Zangazur? What kind of transit do you have?
Goble plan has taken on a life of its own.
One may apply the Goble plan logic to this. Azerbaijan should have a direct land route from Baku through Nakhchivan to Turkey. Azerbaijan restored its control over its territory, and there was barely a hiccup internationally.
Only viable option is direct talks between sides.
That's been true from the beginning.
From the very beginning, yeah, from the early 90s.
Azerbaijan can create facts, and Armenia at present can't.
President Aliyev once said that he knows what to do and when to do.
He has demonstrated a pretty remarkable feel for that, a mental map in his head that corresponds, it seems to me, with geopolitical realities. And so I'm hopeful that will continue.
Hello, everybody. The Azerbaijani-Armenian peace process has visibly stalled, with Baku increasingly disillusioned with the Western mediation and Yerevan unwilling to take part in any discussion on the Moscow platform. As a West-Russia confrontation spirals into the South Caucasus, many people argue that direct talks between Baku and Yerevan would be the best viable option. Of course, it's easier said than done. And today I have a very distinguished guest, Mr. Paul Goble, former advisor to the US State Secretary. It's great to see you, sir. How have you been?
Fine, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. A long time no see. I remember our last conversation in June 2022. Of course, back then the circumstances on the ground were quite different, and much has changed since that point. And the most fundamental change is that Azerbaijan, on the 20th of September, restored its full sovereignty over the rest of Karabakh. Had you anticipated this kind of decisive move by Azerbaijan during the course of 2023, 2 years prior to 2025?
It was always a possibility, given the disproportionate power of Azerbaijan on the one hand and Armenia on the other. It became more likely as the world seems to have descended into an acceptance of the use of violence, be it in Russia with respect to Ukraine or in the Middle East. And therefore, it was clearly the case that Baku could move now with less likelihood of the kind of withering criticism it would have received had the expanded Russian invasion of Ukraine not happened, had the conflict in the Middle East not reignited. So I've always thought, I've said this, I've written it for a long time, that unless Armenia is willing to make serious concessions, Azerbaijan eventually wins on the ground simply because of disproportionate power. So I was not surprised that this happened. I certainly can't claim to have predicted it any particular date, but it was clear that Azerbaijan would do this if Armenia didn't move, and Armenia's reluctance to do anything, and the fact that Armenia clearly was losing support internationally, gave Baku an opening, and President Aliyev took it.
To what extent do you concur with the assertion that now, as of November 2023, the Karabakh issue, in many respects, resolved? So, of course, there is an issue of the return of the Karabakh Armenians, and there is a Western pressure on Azerbaijan, but fundamentally, the issue is now solved. Would you concur with this assertion?
No, I mean, in this one, this is not just about a matter of words. The fact is that given that there are more than 100,000 people who have fled from Karabakh into Armenia and elsewhere, that there are several 100,000 people who were Azerbaijanis who were forced out of there and who want to return, and this is going to cast a shadow. I think it's best to speak of a the end of a phase of the Karabakh conflict. This is the difficulties that were created by the erection of a pseudo-state Artsakh on our Azerbaijani territory a long time ago, 30 years ago now, are going to be with us for a very long time. People who have lost relatives, people who have lost homes on both sides are not going to let this go away. I don't think we're talking about a new military confrontation or the return of an Armenian statelet on Azerbaijani territory. And if that's all one means by the end of the Karabakh conflict, then it's probably true to say that we have achieved that. If one wants to say that all of the issues involved in the Karabakh conflict have been resolved, that's not true. And arguably, and many of us have said this for a very long time, the Karabakh conflict was only part of a much larger issue of the sorting out of peoples and territories in the South Caucasus. One of the places that hasn't been solved yet has to do with the Zangazur corridor.
Sure, we'll come to that a bit later.
I think that those are all related to what came to be called the Karabakh crisis. It was always larger and more significant than just the territory of Artsakh.
Well, so in your judgment, one phase is over, but there's a new phase which is about to begin. Back in the early 90s, to be more precise, in January 1992, shortly after resigning from your post as a special advisor on Soviet nationality issues and Baltic affairs at the US State Department, you presented a background paper for the then US State Secretary. In that paper, you argued that there were three ways of sorting out the Karabakh issue. First one, driving out all Armenians from Karabakh. Second one, imposing a large wall between the sides, stopping them from fighting. And the third one is giving Karabakh to Armenia. And then you argued, you objected against all of the three options, said that, on different grounds, of course, and you suggested something which is known as Goble plan. It's a swap between territories, between Zangazur and Karabakh. So Zangazur going to Azerbaijan and Karabakh to Armenia. Of course, the land swap element is no longer tenable because Azerbaijan fully resumed control over the Karabakh. But in your argument back then, what I discerned, there was no room for Armenians staying in Karabakh and living under the Azerbaijani jurisdiction. Have your thoughts to that effect changed recently?
Well, when I wrote this, and please remember that this is more than 30 years ago, and that it was an essay written for a then former Secretary of State who was coming to Karabakh. And Americans like a solution. If you tell them there's a problem, then the first question is, well, what do we do about it? So I was trying to lay out a possibility. It has always been my view that it would be very, very difficult after the events of the late 80s, and I would argue even more after the events of the early 90s, that Azerbaijanis would be willing to accept a large Armenian population on its territory in Karabakh, that it was simply going to be the case that there's too much distrust and that the Armenians would leave. What I was trying to do and what I wrote is to suggest that if you want to argue, as many did in 91 and 92, that Karabakh as an Armenian area ought to be part of Armenia, the only way that you could make that possible was by Armenia offering to Azerbaijan something that it has long wanted. And that, of course, is the Zangazur corridor between Azerbaijan proper and Nakhchivan. This was written less than 2 weeks after the Soviet Union had dissolved. It was a period of enormous fluidity. And this was an idea that if one wanted to recognize the Armenian enclave, or Karabakh as an Armenian enclave, then it was going to be almost necessary that it be transferred to Armenia or Armenian control. And the only way that would be possible, given the power imbalances, was for Armenia to offer Azerbaijan something that Azerbaijan very much wanted. Um, I I think that was not a implausible approach in 1992. I think that I said this in that paper. Most people read the last two paragraphs where this
I read
is
it.
and
It's
not the entire paper.
3,300
But
words, I
I
believe.
look, the fact was and is that over time Azerbaijan was going to become stronger and stronger because of its oil and gas reserves, and Armenia was going to become weaker and weaker because of its lack of an indigenous industry and raw materials. That being the case, the reason for thinking that such a transfer would have been possible in the early 90s was that this was going to be the only way, and I say this, the only way that Armenia would have been able to maintain its position in Karabakh, because eventually Azerbaijan would be in the position not only to destroy the statelet and lead to the expulsion of ethnic Armenians from the region, but as has been pointed out by the current president of Azerbaijan, it could at some point use force and retake Zangazur, and there's not much that Armenia could do to stop that. So, because that swap wasn't tried in 92 or 93, we're now in a situation where the Azerbaijan promises to sweep the board, and Armenia plans to lose both. Now, I'm one of the people who praised President Aliyev after the 44-day war for stopping it when he did, rather than going ahead and taking Stepanakert, which Azerbaijan certainly could have done, and sparking a mass refugee flow. I felt that gave Azerbaijan credibility as a power that could be tolerant, and bought Azerbaijan a lot of praise. Now, of course, after an interval, Azerbaijan has done just that. It's taken Stepanakert. There's been a mass flight of more than 100,000 ethnic Armenians from the region. And the question is, what's next in Zangazur? What kind of transit do you have? My ideas are, I think, of 1992 have been overtaken by events, but the logic of the logic there, which reflected the events of 91 and 92, I think remains compelling, but it no longer is applicable. And so now we're in a situation where Armenia, unless it makes some real concessions, may find itself very much more isolated. And all the talk of an Araks corridor through Iran rather than a Zangazur corridor through Armenia's Syunik Oblast, it seems to me is something that in some ways will put Armenia at greater risk than would otherwise be the case. So that's the history of it, and I don't reject what I wrote. I just would insist that it's no longer relevant 30 years later.
Well, I mean, Azerbaijani view, I mean, officially declared view is that, I mean, Azerbaijan has never encouraged those Karabakh Armenians to leave Karabakh. In fact, Azerbaijan encouraged them to stay. And now Azerbaijan is saying that they're more than welcome to come back. Of course, it's a very complicated issue, and we'll come back to that a bit later. So you effectively mentioned that narrative, which has gained some traction in the West and wholeheartedly embraced by Armenia. And that narrative says that Azerbaijan, after restoring its sovereignty over the Karabakh region, and now is intent on capturing what Armenians call Syunik and what Azerbaijanis call Zangazur. So this is a very famous sort of narrative. So do you think this narrative is mostly about Azerbaijan's intentions, or it is actually about Russia because it is very clear that the West wants to support Armenia under the circumstances. And the narrative implies that Azerbaijan will do that with Turkish support and Russian silence. So do you think this narrative is mostly directed at Azerbaijan or Russia?
Well, everything is now wrapped up with what Russia is doing and with the standoff between the West and Moscow over the Russian invasion in Ukraine. I mean, that's just has to be common ground. Having said that, the question is, what kind of a opening of transport routes does anyone want in the South Caucasus? If the tripartite declaration, and it was only a declaration, not an agreement, in November of 1920 or 2020 had been realized, the fact is Armenia would have been a major beneficiary because its transportation situation would have been much better. If the situation is such that an Arax route is chosen through Iran, the fact of the matter is that Iran and Russia have been far more cooperative, essentially against Turkey and the West, than Armenia right now is, which is much more prepared to cooperate with the West. So, what that probably means is that Tehran and Moscow, in coordination, either openly or sub rosa, could pose a challenge to Azerbaijan's use of East-West trade. Armenia, however, could also be a big loser because it won't get the transit route that it hoped for through Azerbaijan to Russia. That will probably mean that Armenia will move even further away from Moscow, that the French influence will grow, the West influence behind it. And so that's why I wasn't prepared to say earlier that the Karabakh crisis is over, because I can see all kinds of ways that this can go wrong in the future. We may not call it the Karabakh crisis anymore, but the fact is the underlying geopolitics of the South Caucasus, a geopolitics that has been defined by Russian behavior in Soviet times and even before, is going to be with us for a very long time.
But your plan, the famous Goble plan, has taken on a life of its own. I mean, original idea was about territorial swap, but later, during Azerbaijani-Armenian discussions, we have noticed some manifestations and reincarnations of that plan in different ways. For example, I remember back in 2021, Azerbaijan was arguing for the sameness of the regimes of Zangazur corridor and Lachin corridor back then. I see the element of Goble plan there as well. And now something very interesting is happening, actually. So Azerbaijan is saying that, of course, Karabakh Armenians are more than welcome to come back if they consider themselves to be Karabakh Armenians, but they have to apply for Azerbaijani citizenship. And there is a new issue, a new concept called Western Azerbaijan, which is about the voluntary and dignified return of those Azerbaijanis who were expelled from modern-day Armenia in the late 80s back to their ancestral homeland. So again, we see Zangazur and Karabakh issues being very interrelated. Have you noticed this self-same pattern?
Well, one may apply the Goble plan logic to this. Yeah. My own view is that this is part of the deep structure of the territorial and demographic arrangements in the South Caucasus. What we have seen is a sorting out of the ethnicities in the South Caucasus. Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan are all vastly more monoethnic states than they were in 91, caused by birth rates, caused by departures of minorities, and so forth. We have also seen efforts to redraw the borders. The Russians did it in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, at least temporarily, and the Armenians tried with Artsakh. It seems to me that this is the working out of the geopolitical arrangements that Moscow made in Soviet times, and even before, and that one should not be surprised that in that situation, people are going to do try to find something where you do one thing and we'll do one thing. It's what negotiations are usually about. If people want to extend the Goble plan into this as some kind of geopolitical model for all things, well, I guess they're free to do it. The original author of the Goble plan wouldn't do it. He would say that this is simply part of the way that the business is carried out in a place which is sorting out. I think that one of the great untold stories of the events of 91 has been that we have seen a sorting out of these countries ethnically. Every single one of the former Soviet republics, except Russia, is more ethnically homogeneous today than it was in 91. That's sort of what we would expect in a post-imperial time, but it's certainly not over. And there are territorial disputes all over the place. Most of them haven't attracted great international attention. There's a conflict between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, between Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. There's the question of Karabakh in Uzbekistan, which both Kazakhstan and Russia have an interest in. There's all the events in the South Caucasus, and one can even put the Russian invasion of Ukraine in that category, given the Moscow's understanding of what is true about Eastern Ukraine, that these are in fact Russians and they should be part of Russia. I mean, what we're seeing is part of a huge geopolitical trend, which is almost everywhere. And I think what we're seeing in the South Caucasus is a subset of that, rather than some kind of unique experience. But I would just add one thing, which is related to this, but not identical, and that is, after the Armenian victories in 92 and 93, hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis fled. I visited the refugee camps around Baku many years ago, in the late 90s. No state, no government can ignore that kind of refugee population. And that becomes, let's get them returned. And what I see as one of the stories, which isn't getting much ink yet, but it was going to drive Azerbaijani politics and much else, is going to be the demands of those people who've been in refugee camps, in some cases for more than 25 years, to go back to where their homes were. And that the ability and willingness of the Azerbaijani government to make that happen is going to determine a great deal about the future.
Do you believe that Azerbaijan's decision to put an emphasis on the Iranian route now, as opposed to Zangazur corridor, is more of a tactical move in order to be able to attract a certain degree of reciprocity from Armenia? Because for Baku, Zangazur corridor is very important. We understand that. It's a land passage connecting mainland territory with exclave. Iranian route is an alternative. So my question is it, in your judgment, from your observation, would you say it's a tactical move in order to attract Armenian reciprocity?
Well, I think it's tactical in a double sense. I think it's tactical in the sense that you mean that it is trying to come up with a way to put pressure on Yerevan for concessions elsewhere, including in the transportation network across Syunik Zangazur. I think it's tactical, however, in a much more important sense. I really don't believe that most Azerbaijanis think that Zangazur corridor should remain part of Armenia. I think that they believe that Azerbaijan should include Zangazur. I mean, there are people in Azerbaijan, including in the government, who've talked about the fact that Yerevan, not so long ago, was part of Turkic Muslim civilization, and raising questions about even the existence of Armenia.
Do you think that
those voices are marginal, I think, but the notion that Azerbaijan should be a contiguous country, that there should not be this island separated, that Azerbaijan should have a direct land route from Baku through Nakhchivan to Turkey, I think is very, very central to Azerbaijani thinking. So I think the talk about the Araks alternative corridor is tactical in that sense too. I think that people are not about to turn away from the notion that eventually Zangazur should be part of Azerbaijan. And that is going to be a driver of politics. That doesn't mean you send in the army today. That doesn't mean that you mobilize people. But look, I've seen people, Azerbaijanis, line up at the Iranian embassy to get visas, to get on buses, to go through Iran to get to Nakhchivan. I don't think any Azerbaijani politician wants that to continue. Is Tehran going to be willing to allow visa-free and unobstructed travel between Azerbaijan proper and Nakhchivan? Let me just say, I very much doubt that on a permanent basis. It might agree to that for a time, but Tehran has an agenda vis-a-vis the Turkic world, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, which will make it very tempting for any Iranian government in the future to think about using its control of the land over which this corridor would, the so-called Araks corridor would pass, against Baku and Ankara. And if it used it, then the problem isn't solved. And I think that people in Azerbaijan understand that, so that it is tactical to talk about this because it doesn't reflect the broader goals of Baku.
Sure. I mean, of course, Azerbaijan wants to have access to Nakhchivan. I don't think Azerbaijan does advocate for any form of extraterritoriality, because if you remember, in early 2023, President Aliyev, when he was in Germany, in Munich, said that we want to install the border checkpoint at the entrance to the Laçın Road, and Armenia is more than entitled to install border checkpoints at both entrances of the Zangazur corridor. From my perspective, that was a milestone. So Azerbaijan effectively changed all to this position, because initially we were talking about extraterritoriality. That has changed, but of course dynamics are in a flux. I mean, they're changing all the time. We will see what's going to happen in the fullness of time. And what I wanted to ask you about is about the recent hearings at the US Congress. Assistant Secretary of State James O'Brien made a couple of interesting statements, which attracted some reaction from the Azerbaijani Foreign Office, Azerbaijani Foreign Ministry. Do you think current position maintained by Washington is actually useful in the context of Azerbaijani-Armenian peace process? Because it is very clear to me that Azerbaijan will be very skeptical of the Western mediation, in particular mediation of Washington. And we know that some of the fundamental agreements within the Azerbaijani-Armenian peace process have been achieved through Washington. For example, dividing the process into two parts: internal Azerbaijani dynamics and also interstate Yerevan-Baku dynamics. And also, when Brussels process was on the verge of collapse in early 2023, Washington played an important role. There was a meeting organized by Secretary of State Blinken. So where do you see the role of Washington in the context of Azerbaijani-Armenian peace process for the months to come?
Well, I think the long term, the United States is and will remain a superpower. Short term, the United States is focused on other things. But let's remember, Baku looks around and what does it see? Moscow made big promises after the November 20 declaration about using its good offices to force those things to be realized. Moscow didn't do anything. Russian power is in recession in the South Caucasus, and I think Baku, not surprisingly, is looking to itself and looking to Turkey rather than to Moscow or to Washington for a solution. I think one of the things that tends to be ignored is that when the Russians organized these talks, they were a participant. When the Americans organized talks, they were using their good offices to allow the two sides to discuss things. It's a very different situation The United States did not have, at least I don't understand that it had, a specific agenda of how things should be solved. Increasingly, Baku is acting like a regional power, a growing regional power, and the role of outsiders is probably less than it was a decade or more ago. I don't know that that will always be true, but look what happened. I mean, Azerbaijan restored its control over its territory, and there was barely a hiccup internationally. I mean, it's, 100,000 Armenians leave. If there were no war in Ukraine or in the Middle East, somehow I think there would have been vastly more expressions of outrage and concern and an effort to do something about it. But now that's sort of been accepted. That's now part of the landscape. Uh, one of the things, I don't believe we're moving to the multipolar world that Vladimir Putin wants. I think the world is going to be much more complicated than that. I think we're moving to a world where, in an awful lot of cases, regional powers are going to be going it alone more than they're used to, and more than the great powers think maybe is a good thing. So I don't. I think if one explores the question that you're asking, does it mean that if Baku is disappointed with Washington, it necessarily is getting in bed with Moscow? I don't think so. I think Baku is disappointed with a whole bunch of people and has decided, rightly or wrongly, that it needs to take steps on its own, and that it is that Baku and Ankara are closely coordinating things is absolutely the case. I mean, after all, it was the Turkish president who first took the lead in promoting the idea of an Arax corridor, which is interesting given Turkey's relationships with Iran are anything but good. And Baku followed. Wasn't the other way around, at least in public. And when they had their meeting in Nakhchivan, they both sang from the same page. So I think this has less to do with Washington or Moscow and more to do with regional powers and regional considerations. Will that always be the case? Probably not. Am I prepared to say there's going to be a major shift in the next 12 months? No. I think we're going to be seeing this as a regional conflict in which the regional players are the important ones. I'm not sure exactly what the French are going to do in Armenia. That may or may not matter. My guess is it won't matter as much as either the French or the Armenians think, but it could matter more than I do.
And what do you think about using Section 907 amendment as a tool of influencing Baku's behavior? I suppose during 1990s and early 2000s, that section amendment was very important to Azerbaijan. And now Azerbaijan has massively improved its military capabilities, its economic standing. Do you think that section is a useful way of influencing Baku's behavior on the ground by the United States?
It's of declining use.
Okay.
The question of whether you scrap it because it's of declining use is another matter altogether. We still have the amendments that affect emigration from parts of the former Soviet space that date to a period which is no longer true at all. Very often, policies stay in place not because they're doing a lot, but because no one wants to take the initiative to get rid of them. And I think that I don't think that 907 is playing a key role in the thinking either in Washington or in Baku.
I see. Well, currently the landscape is quite complicated. I mean, negotiations have stalled in many ways. I mean, the reason why the Brussels process has stalled because the perception in Azerbaijan is that they put emphasis on the Karabakh Armenians, which Azerbaijan does not like. The Moscow platform is not functional because Armenia does not want to go there, and Azerbaijan itself is very skeptical of the Moscow platform as well. And now it looks like that the only viable option is direct talks between sides.
That's been true from the beginning.
From the very beginning, yeah, from the very beginning, from the early 90s, of course. I believe you have advocated for bilateral talks between two sides for a very long time. So Azerbaijan is very willing to have bilateral talks somewhere in Georgia, maybe on the border. Azerbaijan's point of view is that we should sort out all of these problems within the framework of our region. And Presidential Aide Hikmet Hajiyev recently stated on X platform that Azerbaijan sent the fifth version of the peace treaty, and Azerbaijan expects to receive an answer from Armenia. Armenia seems to be less willing towards bilateral talks. Probably, it's my assumption, I could be wrong, because they want to see somebody else like France to back them up, to prop them up. So my question is, what is the prospect of bilateral talk, and what, in your judgment, hinders this process now?
As you said, I've been an advocate of direct talks from the beginning. I've always thought that the idea that some outsider was going to solve the problem for either side was unlikely to be true. And indeed, if it was tried, it wouldn't work. I think that the two sides have to agree that Azerbaijan and Armenia have different views about the desirability of pure bilateral talks versus the involvement of outsiders is no surprise. Armenia is far and away the weaker of these two, and therefore it's looking for any kind of support it can get. Azerbaijan, as I said, if Azerbaijan wanted to take the Zangazur corridor tomorrow, it could. It would cost it a great deal internationally, but it would not provoke a Russian thrust. It would not, all the things. Now, I'm not advocating that. But what I'm saying is the reality on the ground is that Azerbaijan can create facts and Armenia at present can't. And so, not surprisingly, Armenia doesn't want to go into talks where it doesn't have outside support, whereas Azerbaijan can go into talks because it doesn't have to go for that, because it has the ability to impose its will anyway. I think that what we're seeing reflects a simple logic of the way international relations work, rather than some kind of conspiracy or calculation or odd calculation in either Baku or Yerevan. It's often very useful in thinking about conflicts to pull back from all of the noise about the individual situation and to think about, imagine two countries. One has got a huge military, the other doesn't. One has a burgeoning economy, the other doesn't. How would you expect them to behave? Well, I would argue you'd expect them to behave very much the way Azerbaijan has behaved and the way Armenia has behaved. And that's independent of the people who were in office. This is a deep structure of the way the international system works. And I would be surprised if Armenia or Azerbaijan were behaving differently. What I've tried to do in my own writing over the last 30 some years is to praise Azerbaijan when it has been clever enough to recognize that going too far, too fast is counterproductive. That it will achieve much more if it proceeds slowly and cautiously rather than if it takes all that it could, because a sudden movement. I mean, I think if in 2020, Azerbaijani forces had taken Stepanakert and that you'd had 100,000 Armenians fleeing to Armenia at that point, I think the consequences for Azerbaijan would have been far more negative, and you would have had far more likelihood of either Russian or American efforts to back Armenia than you have as things have worked out.
President Aliyev once said that he knows what to do and when to do. Do you think he is able? Do you think he's actually somebody who knows what to do and when to do?
I think he has demonstrated a pretty remarkable feel for that. I think we could all come up with times when we would have done it differently and at a different time that he has. Having said that, I think that the fact that he has said something like that is to reveal a mental map in his head that corresponds, it seems to me, with geopolitical realities. And so I'm hopeful that will continue.
Are you still of the opinion that Russia fundamentally does not want a peace deal between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and it wants to thrive on the ongoing tensions to get its own way?
I believe that Moscow, first, last, and always, likes having conflicts so that it can play one side against the other. If it gets to a point where it can't ensure that there are conflicts, then it tries to make the best of a bad job. I would argue that the enthusiasm in Moscow at present for the Araks corridor, and it's really quite amazing how enthusiastic some Russian commentators now are, is a way to make the best of a bad job. If you can't get credit in Baku for reopening transport corridors through Zangazur, what better thing than to have them go through Iran, a close ally of Vladimir Putin's, and a country that has demonstrated that its word and commitments aren't worth a whole lot, and that it's willing to turn on a dime to promote its geopolitical interests, and is historically and presently hostile to Turkey and hostile to Azerbaijan. I mean, let's not forget that it has been a very, very short time since the Iranians moved military forces up to the Azerbaijani border. That's hardly that's hardly the action of a country that can be counted on to be consistently friendly, no matter which way the geopolitical winds blow.
What we noticed during the recent hearings at the US Congress is that when James O'Brien was asked about Armenia's role in circumventing sanctions levied against Russia, he effectively defended Armenia, saying that they can't control their borders. And also, when I remember before Pashinyan, when there was a speculation about Armenia helping Iran circumvent sanctions levied against Tehran, there was a certain degree of softness in relation to Yerevan as well. But when it comes to Azerbaijan, when Azerbaijan wants to have alternative corridor going through Iran, Azerbaijan's position is not tolerated. So it looks like, from the perspective of Washington or general Western position, in relation to Armenia, there are lots of concessions. With regard to Azerbaijan, there are lots of demands. I mean, would you concur with my feeling, or would you argue otherwise?
Well, uh, I think one can certainly, at one level, completely agree with that presentation of reality. At another level, I think one has to ask why that might be. Um, Historically, Americans have almost always, been on the side of the weaker party in any dispute. That tends to be an American habit of mind. And we tend to look at those groups that have been victimized with a special sympathy. That's true lots of places, not just in Armenia. I think that there is a notion that Azerbaijan, given its strength and its power, has to be held to a higher standard than countries that are weaker and not in a position to control things. I think it's literally true that Azerbaijan has more control of its borders than Armenia does of its. I mean, I don't think that's something we have to ascribe to an American official. I think that's an objective reality. If that's so, then the flow of goods out of Azerbaijan that violate sanctions is something that people are more concerned about or more willing to be critical of than they are the flow of goods out of a country that doesn't control its borders. That just is going to be the case. So I don't think that I don't think that, although it would undoubtedly appear differently in Baku, I don't think that there's been a tilt away from Azerbaijan to Armenia nearly to the degree that many in Baku think. I think the United States would like to have good relations with both, and I think it cares very, very much, as we know from the deal of the century days and forward, about the flow of hydrocarbons out of the Caspian Basin westward. And so I don't see American policy drifting off in the direction of, following the French, let's say, in terms of Armenia. I think what you're going to see is support and sympathy for Armenians, and the absorption of 100,000 refugees. I think you're going to see a lot of people in the United States tend to have a special feel for Christian countries as opposed to Muslim ones. I think that will continue to be true. And let's be clear, there are a whole bunch of people in the U.S. Congress who were elected with Armenian American votes. So there are very few people in the U.S. Congress who were elected with Azerbaijani American votes, and that's going to play on what you're going to hear in Capitol Hill. It's not the Armenian lobby, which Azerbaijanis like to talk about. It's just simply the way things are, and that's been true in lots of places around the world. Again, America's Baltic policy, which I've been much more closely involved with for a lot longer, you can't begin to understand it until you know that the United States recognized the independence of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in 1922, 5 years after the revolution, because Henry Cabot Lodge was running for re-election to the Senate and needed Lithuanian American votes. And it was very fortunate for Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania that the Soviet invasion came in 1940, because Franklin Roosevelt was running for a third term, and he needed the Lithuanian votes in particular. The Lithuanian Americans vastly outnumber Latvian and Estonian Americans, and therefore was much more disposed to do things that way. I'm not, as I say, I think these things are part of a general pattern rather than a specific conspiracy, and I think we should recognize that.
One of the things which has been recently discussed in Azerbaijan, as you know, during those hearings, James O'Brien said that they're going to establish a special investigative body which will look into the fate of Karabakh Armenians, both prior to the counterterrorism measures by Azerbaijan on the 20th of September and afterwards. And Azerbaijanis are saying that, okay, it's fine, investigate and report, but why have you never investigated the fate of Azerbaijanis expelled from Armenia and from Karabakh? So this sense is deeply embedded in Azerbaijani society that the Washington's approach is very Armenian-centered, and that Armenian-centered approach is not useful. I mean, this is the sentiment here.
I understand that people feel that way. I understand why they have their reasons. All I'm trying to say is that there's a tendency among Azerbaijanis to see this as a Armenian-Azerbaijani specific case. This is the way the Americans are treating Azerbaijanis. What I'm saying is this is the way the United States tends to treat disputes of this kind.
It's a general
pattern. It tends to get on the side of the people it perceives immediately as victims. If you go back to the mid-90s and you look at congressional hearings in the United States, you will see an awful lot of criticism of the fact that there are these hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis who fled from Western Azerbaijan because of the Armenian advance, and look into that, be concerned, focus on it. That shouldn't be forgotten. But there's a tendency to say that never happened. No, it did. And what I'm saying is what you see is what you expect. People tend to react to what's happened in the last 5 minutes rather than what's happened in longer term. I don't disagree that there's a tendency for the U.S. to do certain things a certain way, but I do want to stress that, in my view anyway, it's not driven by an anti-Azeri animus, but by the circumstances.
So it's a sort of a general pattern in a sense. So if to move back to Russia, you made it very clear that Russia is not interested in a sustainable, comprehensive peace deal between Azerbaijan and Armenia, but we also noticed that Russia could be receptive to the changing circumstances on the ground. For example, let's say back in 2022, Azerbaijan considerably augmented its positions along the conditional state border in September 2022, you remember that? And then in Prague, Azerbaijan and Armenia agreed on the principle of mutual recognition of territorial integrity and sovereignty. And then the self-same agreement was reinforced in Sochi. So Russia kind of reacted. Russia didn't like it, but Russia was compelled to understand this position and accept it. And so I remember on one particular occasion you said that Russian government likes declarations, not agreements. Would you say that anything Baku and Yerevan could agree via the Moscow platform will again be a declaration, not an agreement?
I don't think there'll be an agreement coming out of Moscow. I think it'll be a declaration again. And I think that's why having bilateral talks, Russia will try to put sticks in the spokes, and if it can't stop something, it will try to figure out what to do to its greatest benefit of itself in this area. Even though it isn't getting everything it wants to get something. And I think the current boomlet of support in Moscow for the Araks corridor is an example of that. Moscow would be happier not to have that, but that's better in its mind than having an agreement that would really integrate Armenia and Azerbaijan together, lead them to greater cooperation, lead to the revival of the Armenian economy, make it possible for Turkey to project influence into the Caspian region and beyond. Those are not things Moscow is in favor of. So the Arks corridor is a good way to take advantage of what, from Moscow's point of view, is a less than fully desirable situation.
What do you think will become of the Russian contingent still based in Karabakh, as you know? They're still there. Because my feeling is that they are bound to retrench and then pull out later. But it looks like Azerbaijan is somewhat interested in Russian peacekeeping contingent to stay there for the next 2 years in order to avoid any international mission coming to Karabakh. What is your feeling in relation to this situation?
Well, I personally think the Russian peacekeepers will leave at the end of the 5-year term. I think there are some Armenian or Azerbaijanis who are concerned that were there an international mission, it would probably be tilted in Baku's view toward Armenia and Armenian concerns. Having said that, I think the Russian so-called peacekeepers, and they can't be peacekeepers under international law, will become less and less important. And I think they'll disappear relatively quietly by November 25, which is when the 5-year term that was supposedly agreed to by the declaration. They shouldn't have been there to begin with. If you're going to have peacekeepers, you have them from somewhere, from people who aren't involved. But that's what I think. I can imagine that in Baku there are concerns about getting an international peacekeeping unit in, but I think that both things will become non-issues in the coming months. I think that there'll be less and less interest and willingness to have an international peacekeeping effort as the restoration of Azerbaijani sovereignty in what was Karabakh. And I think that that as that interest declines, we'll hear less and less talk about that.
I mean, the Azerbaijani fundamental worry about any form of international mission in Karabakh, in my view, largely stems from the fears, which I could describe as remedial secession fears, because the view here is that, imagine those Karabakh Armenians come back to Azerbaijan unconditionally, and there is a mission, and because the main Armenian argument could be that, okay, Armenia as a state does recognize Azerbaijan's territorial integrity and sovereignty over Karabakh, but Armenians living in Karabakh cannot live under Azerbaijani jurisdiction. And some Azerbaijanis see some inception of the Kosovo version here in Karabakh. Do you think these fears are substantiated in the first place?
I think that's to misread the situation. There were lots of Kosovars who stayed. The number of Armenians who are still ethnic Armenians who are still in Karabakh is so microscopically small. We're talking, I think, certainly less than 10,000, possibly less than 5,000, and I think those numbers will continue to decline. And I don't think Azerbaijan will be able to attract back bigger numbers. I think that in Kosovo you had a large number of Kosovars who stayed. So that's an analogy that doesn't work, it seems to me.
In that case, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's always great
I
delight.
enjoyed this. Let's do it again.
It's always great delight to converse with you, and I hope we will have an opportunity very soon indeed. Take care.
Great. Thank you.